Perfect. And then lastly, to present for those who are here. I'm going to lower the lights. Let me know if that's comfortable.
Joe, do you prefer questions at the end or during?
Which works better for you?
If I take the microphone and go around, it looks better to do it at the end.
Okay, let's do it at the end.
And then they won't interrupt your train of thought.
Okay.
Okay. Is it a good spot for you? See,
You think we can move these off stage?
Yeah, whatever you.
you don't need it.
We don't need them and they're sort of in the way.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
How about this mic?
I know that Nani's
I'm gonna use it.
Do you need it? Okay.
I'm going to use it to introduce you, but then would you like me to put it down here?
Yeah, probably just put it down there now.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
need it.
I can, they won't see me on the thing, but that doesn't really matter, does it?
It's okay.
was thinking, if we just record it, people can watch it on the portal and it's no different so we don't need to pass it.
We don't, right.
Should we bring it up at the next?
I know we touched upon it, you mentioned it.
This is not like we're cutting people off.
No.
They just won't be able to watch it
Live, I would watch it after, let's say, 5 o'clock. That's true, so it'll be accessible to them. But yeah.
I mean, that would be helpful. One last thing
You have your
get
mic?
it all twisted up.
So is this a mic recorder?
Yes, yes, it's for those who are online, and then your lapel is for in-house right now.
So I need to speak loud enough then.
That it can pick up. You can speak as normal. You don't have to. If you want to sing, you could sing. But that's no problem. No problem.
So we're good. I was there. Okay, how are we doing? 1 more minute. This is not our usual day. We're usually on Thursday. So hopefully people won't have forgotten that we're on today. They all got a flyer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. This is not our usual Thursday. It's a Wednesday, but we're glad you are all here and ready to hear this very interesting lecture. I had lunch today with Joe and Elizabeth Chan and with the two residents who told us about him, who said, you've got to have this guy come. That was Faye Lee and Anita Ho and Harry and Linda Wong. So we're thankful for them. We, as a lecture committee, we love having your recommendations. So please keep them coming. We're very happy to know what you're interested in so we can help provide that. Thanks to that lunch, I learned all sorts of things about them, how fascinating they are. They both were born in the U.S. Joe was born in Indiana, went to Indiana University, and Elizabeth was born in Kentucky and went to University of Louisville, right? Joe spent over 30 years in the U.S. Air Force. He was a pilot, a staff officer, squadron commander, and an air attaché. They both have graduated from the Angel Island State Park docent training. Joe started in the class of 2002, and Elizabeth was still working with the Secret Service at that point, so she joined him later on in 2004. They live in Alameda when the weather is lovely here, and during the cooler months, they go to Sun City, Arizona. And being the wonderful volunteers that they are, they both volunteer at the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, which sounds like a very interesting place. And they have said maybe they'll come back and talk to us about that sometime. So anyway, Joe today is going to talk about Angel Island, the Angel Island Immigration Station, and that other one. So please help me welcome Joe Chan. Please turn off your cell phones and hold your questions till the end, please. And then I'll come around with the microphone. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Donnie. And thank you very much for selecting the dreaded after lunch speaking engagement for me. I will try my best to project. I'm Joe Chan, a volunteer docent at the United States Immigration Station on Angel Island. And my wife, Elizabeth, is here with me. She also is a docent at Angel Island. When most of us think about immigration, this image comes to mind. So iconic in our U.S. history, the welcoming statue in New York Harbor, which was actually donated by the people of France to help celebrate the centennial of U.S. independence, but it has come to mean many, many things to many people over the years. This is probably more familiar as an immigration site. This, of course, is the Ellis Island Immigration Station in New York Harbor. How many of you have visited Ellis Island? Goodly number. It's a wonderful, wonderful site, today administered by the National Park Service. During the 50 or so years that Ellis Island was in operation, more than 12 million immigrants from around the world entered the United States through the Ellis Island Immigration Station. And I've read in the past that some 40% of the US population today can trace their roots through Ellis Island. This is a picture of the interior of the Ellis Island Immigration Station when it was open. You notice it looks very orderly in a disorderly fashion. If you disregard all the people there, they did try to organize people by having railings, pathways for immigrants to line up and go through their inspections, lots of benches for them to sit. But one very noticeable portion of this picture is this stairwell. The stairwell led from outside the building, from the ferry landing, where ferry boats would bring immigrants from passenger ships that were anchored in New York Harbor, and they'd bring them to Ellis Island Immigration Station, and the immigrants would have to climb the stairs from downstairs, upstairs into the building. And you notice there's some observers here at the top of the stairs. Immigration and Health Department inspectors would be standing at the top of the steps to watch the immigrants as they struggled up this long staircase. And we had some rules about immigrants back then, just like we do today. And we, the greater we in the United States, were looking for immigrants that were young and healthy and wealthy and educated. Those who are not amongst those four categories were likely to become a public charge, likely to become dependent on the United States government or state governments or local community governments for some sort of assistance, or to use a bad word today, but words that were used back then, welfare, right? So we're trying to avoid admitting people to the United States who are too young, who are too old, who are too poor, who are too uneducated, who are too sick. If one cannot read at least 50 words in one's own language, that was a literacy test that was placed on all immigrants entering the United States at one time. Another one was the wealth standard. Ellis Island required at one time every immigrant entering the United States had to have at least $25 cash so that they could afford to get off the island, right? I mean, if they're admitted by the immigration officials, now what? You know, they have to be able to buy a ticket to Omaha, Nebraska or wherever. So the immigrant would be forced to hand over $25 to the immigration inspector, who would dutifully count it, hand it back, and I've been told that the immigrant would take it and hand it to the next immigrant in line. So likely to become a public charge. Unfortunately, that has become a term in use again amongst some of our immigration turmoil in recent years. But of the 12 million that came through Ellis Island, the vast majority, of course, were from Europe. And this is how the Immigration Hall looks today after renovation. If you had visited there recently, you'll see it's a beautiful structure. They've done a wonderful job in restoration. But today's talk is about a different immigration station, the United States Immigration Station on Angel Island. And it was opened in 1910 to enforce the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That was our nation's very first immigration law, designed specifically to keep a group of people from freely entering the United States, in this case, Chinese workers, because there were just so many of them here that they represented an economic threat to American workers. And I'll get more into those details in just a few minutes. So think back on the gold rush of 1848 in California. Who's here in California in 1848? Not many people before all the gold rushes came. Who?
Native Americans.
Native Americans, of course. Who else was here in 1848? Mexicans, of course. California belonged to Mexico in 1848. Who else? a few Spanish people, right? This is all part of New Spain before even Mexico was here. But there was very little here when all the gold miners show up from across the United States, from around the world, including many Chinese, like this lonely miner. So there's no infrastructure to support perhaps several 100,000 people who show up in California over the years. There are no farms, no cattle ranches, no fruit orchards, no vineyards, no roads, very few building materials. So some Chinese miners decided this gold mining is really too hard. Maybe I can do something else to make a living. And this is true of many gold miners who ended up making the trek to California, but then discovering that it is not as easy as it sounds to make a fortune in the land of the gold mountain. By 1852, just 4 short years into the gold rush, there are 20,000 Chinese in California looking for gold or deciding to do other jobs such as farming, fishing, we'll show you pictures of those in a couple minutes, making shoes, making cigars, making Levi's, doing all this other work that would provide sustenance and supplies to all the gold miners that are here. Following the gold rush comes the building of the first stretch of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed originally in 1869. About 15,000 more Chinese come over to the U.S. to help build the western end of the railroad from Sacramento to Utah to meet up with the eastern end coming from the central part of the United States. A lot of people involved in that, a lot of dangerous work. It's amazing some of the things that people working on the railroad on both ends, both the western end and the eastern end, had to accomplish. This is a picture of the Central Valley of California, stretching from Sacramento almost all the way down to Los Angeles. This Central Valley used to be a giant swamp in many places until Chinese farmers, workers, started working on it shortly after the gold rush begins. They start draining the land and turning it into the agricultural miracle that we know today. The Chinese didn't do it all though, because after the Chinese got started, then Japanese farmers came and started working the land. And after that, men from South Asia, today's India and Pakistan, the Punjabi region, settled in the Central Valley. And many descendants of these South Asians, one can still see their names on signs showing ownership of some of the fruit orchards in the Central Valley. If one travels on Highway 99, coming up from Bakersfield, paralleling Interstate 5, one can see billboards with doctors, lawyers, professionals with South Asian surnames advertising their services. These are all descendants of some of these early South Asian farmers that came here originally. So farming was a big deal with the Chinese. Some of them had been farmers in China before coming here, and they took to the land very naturally. And of course, if one grows crops, one has to sell them, right? That's the ultimate purpose of coming here to America, to try to make money. The fishing industry got to be very big as well, up and down the West Coast. Many Chinese gravitated to that as well. There were fishing villages up and down the coast of California. One of the first fishing villages was located on what is now today the Pebble Beach Golf Course. Until other people chased the Chinese fishing villages away because the land seemed to be worth more for other uses. But the Chinese in California used to fish for squid as they got chased down the food chain. Perhaps they started with whaling, like a lot of other European men of the sea, but they got chased out of whaling into salmon fishing, got chased out of salmon fishing into shrimp fishing, and finally, some Chinese ended up having to fish for squid at nighttime by light of lantern. That was the way to lure the squid up from the bottom of the water and to the surface where they could be netted, and these lanterns would, the light would attract them. And the Chinese used to dry and salt the squid, and most of it was sent back to China, oddly enough. I mean, how many of you eat salted squid, right? But a lot of people in China ate salted squid. And at the time, the Emperor of China had a tax on salt. He had a monopoly all through the country. So whoever bought salt in China had to pay a small tax to the emperor. Well, here comes all this salted squid from California and the United States, and the Chinese were very smart. They would soak squid, soak off some of the salt, boil off some of that salted water. The former salted squid was still salty enough to eat, right? You can't get rid of it all, but that salty water boiled off provided tax-free salt to some Chinese families during the period of the emperor's reign. The Chinese and many other Asians were in all parts of the fishing industry. Here they are filleting fish, salmon, we think, and they were feeding it into a big machine, which eliminated a lot of the handwork that was done by the Chinese and others in the fishing industry. And by feeding the salmon into this machine, it would take off the scales, it would open the belly, it would gut the fish, it would fillet it, and have it ready to be put into the brand new invented tin cans of the day. But all of this industry caused the people of California especially to worry about all these workers in California, all these Chinese workers, because as a group, the Chinese tended to work longer, harder, but most importantly, cheaper than other groups. So other groups started feeling the Chinese were an economic threat to them, taking jobs away from good Americans. So even the labor unions in California got behind the effort, and this is during the 1870s, and they convinced Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, our nation's very first law designed to keep a group of people from freely immigrating to the United States, in this case, Chinese workers. So after the act was passed, our first immigration law, the US government has to create the Immigration Service to enforce the law. So they have to come up with some procedures. Well, what do we do now to keep the Chinese out? So they started on ships that were anchored in San Francisco Bay, coming over from Hong Kong, from Japan, from Hawaii, from wherever, to San Francisco. And the immigration officials would board the ships and inspect the immigrant passengers on board the ship until the shipping company decides, oh, wait a minute, this is taking way too long. We want our ship back so we can load it up with good California goods and send back to China or elsewhere and make a profit. So the Immigration Service would move the immigrants to another ship and another ship. And each shipping company in turn would raise their anger with the US government. And so finally, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, which was the first regularly scheduled passenger line from Hong Kong to San Francisco, they decided to volunteer a warehouse that was on the docks of San Francisco, down in South San Francisco here, and a warehouse so that the Immigration Service could inspect immigrants there. So it's a warehouse. No separate dormitories for men, for women, no bathrooms, no kitchens, no dining rooms, just a warehouse. Most unsatisfactory, and this situation existed from sometime after 1882, and we go through all the ship inspections until 1910, when the immigration station finally opens. So the immigration station opened on Angel Island here in San Francisco Bay. It is the largest natural island in the bay. Here's a photo of Angel Island taken from a ferry boat going from Alameda to San Francisco. It's a fairly large island, about 1 square mile. And this is a depiction of the immigration station in its planning stages. So there's a large dock where ferry boats can bring immigrants from passenger ships anchored in the harbor and led into the large administration building, a large 2-story wood frame building, which was the headquarters for the Immigration Service. And the lower floor had offices for inspections and for all the paperwork that needed to be done. And the second floor of the admin building, there were actually apartments and dormitories originally for European immigrants. We had a hospital where immigrants would be treated. There was a separate entrance to that hospital for Asiatics, separate entrances for Europeans, separate rooms or wards for each national group. Most immigrants were detained in the immigration station barracks, built right behind the admin building, and there was a covered stairway connecting the dining areas and the kitchens in the rear of the admin building to the barracks where most immigrants were staying. And this is a power plant which provided steam heat for all of our buildings, and it also provided steam for our cooking stoves. I've never seen or heard of a steam cooking stove before coming to Angel Island. This is a photo of the newly opened immigration station. Again, we see the wharf area, the 2-story administration building with dormitories and apartments upstairs, the immigration station barracks behind the admin building, the hospital, and the power plant. Another view of the admin building, looking from the end of the wharf to this imposing building that the immigrants would stare at as they're marching off their ferry boats and onto U.S. soil for the first time, perhaps. The architect who designed the U.S. immigration station on Angel Island actually went to Ellis Island to get some ideas from their immigration station. And one can see in much smaller measure, the railings directing traffic on the main floor plan of the building, benches for the immigrants, very orderly flow of people replicated in much smaller fashion on Angel Island, but very similar to what was occurring on Ellis Island. The initial inspections were actually done on board ship for many, many years, not just from the beginning, but even after the immigration station opened on Angel Island. Health department and immigration officials would board each passenger ship as it anchored in San Francisco Bay, and they'd take a quick look at the passenger manifest, see who's on board, who's in first and second class. These people had money. They could afford a nice, expensive cabin above decks. These are probably our exempt classes, exempt from further immigration inspection. These are diplomats, our teachers and students, our merchants, who are important because they bring money into the United States. And most critically, sons and daughters of merchants, sons and daughters of American citizens of Chinese descent are still allowed to enter the U.S. We're just trying to keep those workers out. So after this cursory inspection, we find out who's got money, who's wearing nice clothes, who's living above decks. Many of them speak English. These must be our merchants, our merchant families. They're allowed in the country automatically. No further questions. But everyone else who's downstairs, below decks, in third class or steerage, they could not afford a nice expensive ticket above decks. They're not dressed very well. Most of them do not speak English. Most of them are Chinese. They're immediately suspected of being illegal immigrants. So let's bring the whole lot of the third class passengers into Angel Island for further inspection. So here we see a typical load of Chinese immigrants coming off the ferry boat at the end of our 200-foot wharf on Angel Island. As you can see, they're not dressed as well as the first and second class passengers in the previous photo. These are suspected of being workers. God forbid, we're trying to keep those people out. So they're brought to Angel Island for further examination. This is a group of Japanese women. Usually the men were separated from the women regardless of nationality. For the Chinese especially, children aged 12 and under had to stay with the women, and they were moved into different dormitories in different buildings perhaps. But we can see a warehouse at one end of the wharf. This was so the immigrants could leave their large suitcases and trunks because there just was not enough room to carry all that baggage up the covered stairway and into the barracks where most of them were being detained. The first order of business is a physical examination. We're in the United States, right? We're trying to sort out who might be sick, who might be lame, who might be insane. All these bad terms that we used to use, right, for categorizing people. So the physical examination was done without any clothes on. Bad news for the Chinese at the time, because in China, if one had to go to visit a doctor, modesty prevailed. One did not have to take off his or her clothes. The doctor might touch you to take your pulse, to feel if you're hot or cold, and diagnose your illness from that. Probably prescribe some ancient Chinese herbal medicine, which would clear you right up. But here in the United States, strip, take off your clothes. We know that this is a staged or posed photo by the Immigration Service because these boys and young men still have their pants and shoes on. But in the real physical, they'd be standing there stark naked. We can see the procedure. The examiner is looking at the immigrant's eyes, and he uses his fingers to open the eyelids real wide, looking for some eye disease, and then comes on down the body, poking and prodding for other things, and finally spreading one's toes apart with his fingers, looking for some foot disease. So that's the drill, from the eyes down to the toes, from the eyes down to the toes. They did not wear rubber gloves back then during the examination. They did not wash their hands between hands and feet or between patients. What we see is what we got. In addition, we might notice this white porcelain pan sitting there. Every immigrant in the real physical would be handed a white porcelain pan and expected to produce a stool sample. Right there in front of the attended masses, right? Fellow immigrants and from the health department and from the immigration officials. Produce right now, on demand. You cannot leave the room until we have something in the pan. That was so they could examine for worms, I guess, parasites, whatever. We have to protect the American populace, right, from all these foreigners. After the physical, then they're herded into their dormitories, whether it be on the second floor of the admin building or in the barracks. This is probably taken in the barracks. We had 2 large rooms, both for Chinese men inside the immigration barracks building, and each room held 200 bunk beds. Looking very similar to this, 3-tier bunks. So imagine being cooped up in a dormitory with 199 other people, 24 hours a day, except for 3 30-minute meal periods and perhaps a 1-hour exercise period. And all of this detention and waiting is for the dreaded interrogation that the Chinese would have to go through. This was the Asiatic dining hall. There was also a European dining hall. But in the Asiatic dining hall, the Chinese ate at separate times from the Japanese, ate at separate times from the South Asians. The men ate at separate times from the women and children. They'd come down the covered stairway from the barracks into their respective dining halls for the 3 30-minute meal periods every day. Needless to say, the food was not very good, unlike our wonderful lunch here today. Besides waiting for the interrogation and the 3 meals a day, the Chinese had an exercise yard. It's in a small area at the end of the immigration station barracks. As you can see, it doesn't look very big. The European men had a slightly larger yard that was behind the barracks. It was about the size of a small soccer field. So they could go out an hour a day and get some fresh air, just like the Chinese men, only here in much more crowded circumstances. The women and children, on the other hand, were allowed to walk the grounds if they were escorted by a female immigration service matron or guard or agent, and they could walk the beautiful manicured garden-like setting roughly between the hospital and the barracks, which is on this side of the building, but or the picture rather. But as you can see, the Chinese women and children are dressed pretty well. We know these are staged photos because the immigrants just would not be wearing those kind of nice clothes every day. We have equally nice photos of Japanese women standing on the front porch of our hospital overlooking the waterfront. They're also dressed in their nice silk kimonos, but probably told to do so by the Immigration Service for publicity purposes. This is a picture of the wharf that the ferry boats were docked at. This was the warehouse where the immigrants had to leave their baggage. But they're all waiting for the interrogation if they are brought to immigration. We are trying to find out who's telling the truth about their paperwork and who may be lying about their paperwork, trying to sneak in the country illegally. So we're playing still a lot of the same games today with immigration, aren't we? We are interrogating immigrants, only we do it overseas today at our American consulates and embassies in foreign countries before the immigrant even leaves their home country. Because we're trying to sort out who's allowed to come in the US legally, who's trying to sneak in. If they're coming on a visitor visa, we certainly don't want them to jump ship once they arrive in the United States. So we have to question them and find out what's going to draw that person back to Germany or China or Korea or wherever they're coming from. Show us your bank book. Show us what property you own. Tell us what family you have here. Are you married? Is your mom and dad here? What are all these strings that are going to draw a person back to their home after visiting the United States? Unfortunately, as part of our history, we had a disastrous fire in 1940, which burned down the admin building, the headquarters for the Immigration Service here. It probably started in the rear where the kitchen and dining areas were. Fortunately, the barracks was saved. Nobody was hurt, but this closes the immigration function on Angel Island. Immigration Service moves back to San Francisco, where it had been prior to 1910. Initially, it moves to a building on Silver Avenue, 801 Silver Avenue in South San Francisco, that was originally a Salvation Army training school. And I believe today it is still a private school. But after a couple years there, it moves to its current location on Sansom Street in downtown San Francisco. And today, of course, it's known as the ICE building, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But what saved the barracks from destruction was Chinese poems, Chinese calligraphy carved on the wood walls of the barracks, on every wall of every room. There used to be signs in 5 languages throughout the barracks: do not write on the walls. But young men, being the majority of immigrants from every nation, including Ellis Island, like to leave their mark on the walls. And most people from most countries leave little more than date and name. But the Chinese, for whatever reason, resorted to putting poetry on our walls. We don't know why. Very few of the poems are signed, so we don't know who did them. We've never had a former detainee come forward and say, "That's my poem." We've never read or heard an oral history, of which we have many, which explain how the poems were done, who did them, why they were done. Were they done because the Chinese were here at the immigration station under the most severe circumstances, the Chinese Exclusion Act? Were they done because the Chinese were detained on Angel Island longer than the average immigrant? Chinese were there an average of 3.5 weeks. The longest was 22 months for a Chinese person on Angel Island. The poems are very similar in some respects to the themes. They tell us the sorrow, the anger, the sad circumstances, the worry that the immigrants had while they were waiting there for decisions to be made on their futures. But what's interesting about the poetry is that many of our poems contain references to classical Chinese literature, to Chinese historical figures that only a scholar could have learned in school many years ago. memorized all this time and incorporated in a poem on the walls of the barracks, that's a real stretch of the imagination for me. It tells a different story than what most people think of the immigrants that were detained on Angel Island. They were not all ignorant, uneducated country bumpkins. Many of them had money, enough money to afford an education, at least through middle school or high school, to have learned classical literature, to have learned Chinese history, and learn how to write poetry. This would have been the equivalent of writing a Shakespearean sonnet in English back in the day, because there are 7 characters per line, 4 lines per stanza, with very strict attention to the rhyme and the meter of each poem. In many of our poems, the 2nd and 4th lines rhyme. Chinese being read from top to bottom, from right to left, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. So, in order to confine oneself, one's thinking into such strict lines and strict rules for creating poetry, that was quite a feat. During the 1970s, when California State Park took over the building again, they wanted to see if they could uncover more poetry for people to enjoy in the future. The yellow over gray paint scheme we see predominant, that was put up by the Army after 1940, after the fire in the admin building. But students with archaeological training were brought in by the state of California to strip away the paint, 1 layer at a time, to try to uncover more poetry for people to enjoy. That's how the students discovered there are up to 9 layers of lead paint on our walls. And the Immigration Service, for their part, they had no idea what these poems were. They didn't know whether it was pornographic material or seditious material, advocating the violent overthrow of the US government. But immigration officials just knew they didn't like it. So they would come through periodically with wood filler, wood putty, and cover over the carvings, and then apply another layer of lead paint. In 1997, the federal government declares the immigration station a National Historic Landmark, largely because of the poetry that was discovered. For many people, this may have been the first example of Chinese American literature in the United States. And this, in turn, led to a rehab of the immigration station. The barracks, you can see, looks pretty nice. They recreated the covered stairway. We did not rebuild the admin building, which was in front, but we did outline the footprint of the admin building in concrete so people could see where it was and how big it was. But this building was amazing. Every wall contained Chinese carvings, as well as many other inscriptions in different languages, the interior walls. So imagine taking down these interior wall panels, very carefully labeling them, setting them aside, and then tearing down the building, down to the bare concrete foundation, which they poured a new foundation, and then put up new 2x4s, 4x4s, 4x8s, new exterior walls, new roof, new recycling system for air, not air conditioned, but still had to have ventilation there, new electrical system, new fire extinguishing system, and then carefully putting up those precious panels on the interior walls again. An amazing feat. And this shows you what has to be done with a National Historic Landmark, because there are federal regulations which tell us what we can and cannot do with National Historic Landmarks. So be very careful if you own or contemplate buying a national or state or city historic landmark, because there are many rules that will tell you what one can and cannot do to that building. We have put words on the landings of the outline of the admin building, which represent emotions that the immigrants might have had as they set foot on American soil for the first time. This is our heritage wall. We have plaques located here, donated by many people, but primarily people who had relatives who were detained at this immigration station. This is an example of a few of the plaques. And obviously each plaque tells a story. Most are donated by Chinese families. This one from a family who knew Tyrus Wong. If you're not familiar with him, he worked for Walt Disney as an adult, and he did the animation for Bambi. And if one compares Bambi, the movie, to previous Walt Disney productions, very different palette of colors, different style that were used. Because unlike the stark red, white, and black Mickey Mouse cartoons previously done by Disney, Bambi was done in very soft pastels, very muted animation. And Tyrus used a lot of Chinese techniques, ancient Chinese art techniques in creating the pictures for Bambi. Alexander Tolstoy is represented. She sailed across the Pacific Ocean from Siberia in 1931. Daughter of the famous Russian author Leo Tolstoy, she describes in exquisite detail her physical examination. Why was she here? Asked the immigration officials. She's coming from a communist country. Is she here to raise trouble with all of our unemployed millions here in the middle of our economic depression? This is Liz's father, detained on Angel Island in 1916 when he was 8 years old. This is my maternal grandmother and her oldest daughter, my Aunt Dorothy. They were detained in 1917 when they came over to the United States to join my grandfather, who owned a big restaurant in Detroit, Michigan. It was big enough during the Roaring '20s that he had a band and a dance floor. He served liquor during Prohibition, the Roaring '20s. This is my father. He was detained in 1926 at the age of 15. This is Liz's mother, who came over in 1939 with their oldest son, Ed's oldest brother, Ed. And they were detained there on their way to Louisville, Kentucky to join the head of the household, Liz's dad, who owned a big laundry in Louisville, Kentucky. And this is my mother, who was detained in 1940 at the immigration station, even though she was an American citizen, born in Detroit, Michigan, holding an American passport after living in China for a few years. When she returned in 1940 to marry my dad, she got off the boat holding a U.S. passport, speaking pretty good English, and the immigration officials looked at her and said, "You're Chinese, you better come with us." So she spent 3 days on Angel Island while they verified who she was. I brought along some resources, some books that are my primary guides for helping people learn more about the immigration station. The primary of which is Angel Island, which is the Bible. It's divided chapter by chapter, telling the experiences of different immigrant groups detained there. But you're free to come up and have a look at these, and please take one of our Angel Island brochures, which will remind you how big the island really is. There's a nice map showing all the facilities of the state park. If you want to contact us, I believe this presentation will be available via your YouTube channel. Any questions?
If you'll wait for me to come. If you'll wait for me to come around with the microphone, I think everybody can hear better. And would you repeat the question,
Sure,
Joe?
certainly.
Because the people online won't be able to. Raise your hand, please, if you have a question. Wayne.
I don't have a question, but I would like to thank Joe and whoever brought him here to give us this presentation, because I'm sure that most of us did not know about the Chinese Exclusion Act or Angel Island. We settled in Chicago, Chinatown, and I worked in New York all my life. I had never heard a word about Angel Island or the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 because they were not in our history book. I only learned about them after we retired to California. Okay, so thank you, Joe, for coming. And I also like to say a word about the other immigration station, which I was locked in for 10 days. Okay, Joe did mention the Sampson Street. I don't know if you know anybody that had been locked in there for 10 days, okay? My family were locked in there for 10 days. I was 13 years old. My brother was 11 years old. We came to this country to be reunited with my father. My father came in 1908. So he never went to Angel Island because Angel Island wasn't built until 1910. So he was one of the lucky dogs, but we were not. Okay, we were locked in for 10 days. And I'd like to tell you the difference between the Sampson Immigration Station and the Angel Island Station, okay? Now, the Sampson Street Immigration, I guess you don't call it station, whatever you call it, it's in a high-riser. So therefore, we don't have place to do exercise. So we were locked in 24 hours and let out 3 times a day to have those lousy meals that we have never eaten in our life until we arrived here, okay? And also during the 10 days, we also had somebody hang herself because she was to be deported back to China. And of course, when you come to this country, you sell everything you have there. Okay, if you're sent back, there's nothing for you. You might as well die here, so to speak, okay? And like I said, we were locked in for 10 days. And the reason, like Joe said, was because they want to make sure that we are children of my father. So what they do is they integrate us for a couple of times within 10 days. And all our answer was sent to Chicago because our dad was working in Chicago and see if they match. If they don't match, we would have been sent back to China, okay? Now talk about a facility. Thank God it was in a high-riser so we could overlook the Golden Gate Bridge through wider window. And I wasn't that tall at that time, but don't forget, I was only 13. So I had to stand on my tiptoe, look out the window, and look at the Golden Bridge and say, oh, I wish I'm out there. But for 10 days, I couldn't be out there, okay? Our bunk beds are better. They're only the 2 levels. The regular bunk bed, not like what you have in the picture with the 3 level, okay? And my brother did get separated from my mother for the first time in his life. Of course, he cried. I mean, there's no reason why he shouldn't. I mean, he's only an 11-year-old boy, right? And I was fortunate enough to be with my mother. So she slept on the top bunk bed, and I slept in the lower bunk bed. And it was not as crowded as what you show in the picture. And I have been to Angel Island numerous times, and I did put a plaque in commemorating my parents for bringing us here. So I am in support of Angel Island every year. I make a donation because simply I don't want history to be repeated again. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. Quick question while we're waiting. What did you call the Sampson Street Immigration Station while you were there?
It's an immigration and naturalization.
Did the term Mo'uk ever come up?
Huh?
Mo'uk?
What?
Woodhouse. Mo'uk.
Huh?
Wooden house.
Woodhouse. In Cantonese. Mo'uk.
唔係啦，佢高樓咯。
Okay, yeah, thank you.
It's very tall. I mean, you could get to look out.
Yes,
and
it-
go
it-
to Gate Bridge. I think you know where it is. I
It-
understand they knock it down and build a elementary school on the site now.
Right,
That's what somebody
Yeah.
told me.
it's,
I haven't been back.
it's a tall building, concrete and granite.
Yeah, it's a
brick.
concrete tall building. I don't know what floor we were on. I have no idea.
Thank you.
Hi, in case you don't know me, my name is Fei Li. Okay, thank you, Mary. I'm not used to it. But anyway, I'd like to share a little bit of my experience in the penthouse a couple of years before Waymoing. Okay, the reason I call it the penthouse is it's high rise. I was 12 years old, naive, first time out of the village. But anyway, I didn't know anything about it, but the point I like to make is being incarcerated in Sansom Street for the short few days is nothing in comparison to for our forefathers who came to Angel Island. And that's what I want to add on to Waymo's experience. Thank you.
And don't forget, that was after the repealing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. We came in 1949.
When I was a teenager, growing up at home, then, you know, I heard about paper sons and paper daughters. The immigrants who came over with fake paper saying that they're, you know, they have family over here, which they didn't. I asked my dad, and he was very defensive and wouldn't talk about it. When we were at Angel Island at this Stone Ridge Creek excursion, I asked the guard who was selling the tickets, and I asked her, I says, do you know anything about the paper sons and paper daughters arriving here? And she said the majority of the immigrants who came over on Angel Island were paper sons and daughters. Can you confirm that?
The question was, were the majority of Chinese immigrants who came to Angel Island paper sons and paper daughters, meaning they had purchased papers claiming to be sons and daughters of merchants or sons and daughters of American citizens of Chinese descent and be allowed to enter the United States legally under the Chinese exclusion law. And this is why the interrogations were conducted, to try to find out who's telling the truth about their paperwork and who may have purchased papers to enter the country illegally. I cannot confirm or deny that. I have read reports in other books, including some of the books here on this table, that repeat what you said. The majority of the Chinese who were interrogated on Angel Island between 1910 and 1940 and admitted it to the United States were indeed paper sons and paper daughters. There are many who want to deny that assertion because we don't want to admit that so many people enter the country illegally from China. But for many Chinese who may have purchased papers, they did not believe they were breaking the law because they felt that Americans were very prejudiced against Chinese and other Asians, and they introduced harsh laws trying to keep Chinese people out of this country, unlike other people who were freely admitted, and they were very angry, most of the Chinese who were detained there, about their conditions and about why they were detained there. Not many people tried to escape from Angel Island, not only because it was a hard place to get out of, it's an island after all, but most Chinese wanted to enter the United States under existing law, even if that meant lying about their backgrounds. They wanted to use the law. They did not want to become criminals, so to speak, by trying to escape and being caught.
Two questions. One, roughly how many people cycle through Angel Island? Number one. Number two, when we met in Angel Island, you also mentioned that in addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there are other exclusion acts against other nationalities. Could you briefly go through that? Thanks.
From the time the station was open, from 1910 until 1940, about 1 million people passed through the United States Immigration Station for the Port of San Francisco. This does not mean they were all detained on Angel Island necessarily, because as I showed you, some passengers were admitted right from the ships, directly from on board ship into the city if they were in the exempt classes. By one author's count, about 500,000 entered the United States through San Francisco immigration. About 500,000 departed the United States because an equal number came here, made their money or whatever, and wanted to go home again. Other exclusion acts. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, more Japanese young men started to enter the U.S. They're coming mainly from the plantations of Hawaii, the sugar plantations there, where they've been working for decades. So the U.S. places some restrictions on Japanese immigration. After that, more young men from South Asia, from the Punjabi region of today's India and Pakistan, start to enter the U.S. to replace many Japanese and Chinese on the farms. So we put some restrictions on South Asian immigration. After that, guess who's our latest economic threat? Why, it's those dreaded Filipinos. My goodness, they're everywhere. They're taking over from the South Asians, the Japanese, the Chinese on many farms here in California. So in 1934, Congress has a big problem. They cannot just pass another exclusion law like they've done with the South Asians, Japanese, and Chinese, because the Philippines in 1934 belonged to us, right? We won it fair and square in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine insurrection that followed. Filipinos are U.S. nationals because the Philippines is a U.S. territory. They're allowed in the mainland of the United States, no passports, no visas required. So Congress comes up with a new plan, and it's absolutely brilliant. They decide to grant the Philippines their independence. It's to be phased in over a 10-year period. Who knew that World War II would interrupt that for a few years? But in 1934, the status of Filipino people as U.S. nationals changed overnight. They were considered aliens from a foreign country. And if they set foot on the United States without proper paperwork, they were declared illegal aliens and deported immediately. By 1917, picture a globe of the world, map of the world, right? Center on Indonesia. And then look west from Indonesia all the way to Turkey. Every nation between Turkey and Indonesia had restrictions, some of them very severe, on immigration to the United States. That was called the Asiatic Barred Zone by the United States government. That's how severe Asian immigration was treated. But I don't want to leave anybody out of our immigration story this afternoon. In 1924, the United States decides we have way too many Southern and Eastern Europeans coming into the United States. We're really tired of all those people. They talk funny. They practice different religions. So we have to do something about it. So in 1924, we placed a limit or a quota on every nation of the world as to how many immigrants are allowed into the country. We still like the Northern Europeans, so we assume that the immigration quota or limit for Brits is like, 80,000 a year. Norwegians, 70,000 a year. Germans, 75,000 a year. But Italians, no. Let's cap it at 35,000 a year. Russians, no, even less, 15,000 a year. So there were severe restrictions on Southern and Eastern Europe, which existed in the quota system until 1965, when President Johnson signs into law pretty much our current immigration system based on family reunions, doing away with national quotas. Long answer.
I have a question about one of your slides in Chinese. The Chinese character is Huang, but the last name in English became Wang, W-O-N-G. So is it because of
the dialect of where the person came from. Can you show the slide again?
Was it the two poems?
It's Cantonese. Wong is Cantonese.
Yeah, I know, but see, that's quite confusing because in Mandarin, Huang is spelled differently.
Was it this slide?
No, the earlier one. There is a name of 3 characters. It's somebody's name start with Huang,
Silas Wong, I think that's
But
what
it-
you're referring to.
but
Slide,
in English,
Silas
it's spelled as W-O-N-G.
Wong.
Because they're all Cantonese.
Yeah, it's a Cantonese.
Anyway,
I'm sorry, I can't think of the picture. What else is in the picture?
3 characters. And when you were showing those famous Chinese ones, they weren't Silas Wong. When you were showing the people, one is Silas Wong, the guy that does the Walt Disney.
Oh, Tyrus Wong.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that one. So W-O-N-G in Mandarin is Huang.
because he's Cantonese.
So that's why I say it's confusing, because in our community, we have Huang, it's spelled H-W-A-N-G.
Right.
But here in Cantonese, it's W-O-N-G.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there are 2 Chinese characters for the surname Wong. They each mean different things, but they're both surnames. But it could be that the American Immigration Service, in translating Tyrus's Chinese name and anglicizing it and putting it in English, so to speak, on the paperwork, just used W-O-N-G instead of H-U-A-N-G. That happened in many cases.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I just want to point it out.
Okay, thank you.
I have something to share with all my friends here. This is an experience that my husband had. My husband Alan is now happily playing bridge upstairs. But Alan was detained in Ellis Island for a few weeks. He came in 1949 at age 14. His parents were already here. They worked very hard to make enough money to send the 3 kids from China. Took them 3 days to fly over. Alan's younger sister never saw the dad because Alan's father left when his wife was pregnant. So the 3 kids were kept on Ellis Island, and they were interrogated separately a few times. Main reason is they want to make sure they will not paper children, that they actually belong to the same family. Fortunately, the Chinese were experienced, so they were drilled. Make sure you remember, when we eat dinner, you sit over there, and your older brother sit here, and this, our window has this, our backyard has this. So they pass all the tests. Who sat where when you have breakfast? But one time they asked my sister-in-law, did you have a family pet? She said, no. When they asked Alan said, yes, we had a dog. Then they interviewed the sister and said, you sure you didn't have a family pet? She said, I don't think so. Oh yeah, we ate them. I don't know whether they ate them or they sold them, but she said, yeah, we did happen. So, of course, the happy story is they did get released, and now they are very happy American citizens. Thank you.
If I could add to that, the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943 when we were allies with China in fighting Japan during World War II. So Chinese immigration then reverts to the then law of the land, the quota system. And the quota for Chinese immigrants to the United States was 105 a year. Whereas other nations under the quota system were, several tens of thousands. So fast forward to when your family was in Ellis Island in 1949, the quota for Chinese immigrants is still 105 a year. Immigrants, all right? So anyone who's trying to come in as an immigrant has to pass the interrogation to try to come in under that 105 quota a year. If one came in and was the 106th person that year from China, one would get turned around and sent back to China to have to wait until next year when the quota clock starts again. That's how severely the quota system was enforced.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to add a little bit to this too. Yes, we came under the 105 quota, so we waited for 3 years. And my dad even to have the war captain. He happens to be Democratic. And in Chicago, they have what they call war captain. They are in charge of the whole neighborhood, whether you're Democratic. I don't know about Republican, but Democrat, they had war captain. So anyway, I don't know, he had to pay him or whatever. And the war captain actually had the congressman plead our case, okay? And I got the letter. I could show it to anybody if you want to look at it. So I think we're lucky even to come within the 3 years of waiting period, okay? Now, as far as the name Wong is concerned, most of the early people that come to America are from what we call the 5 towns. As a matter of fact, there's a big museum in Gongmun that is called Wu Ye Museum, 5-town museum. They had all kinds of history commemorating the Chinese that came to this country in the old days. I'm not talking about the new days. You see, since 1960, when Kennedy opened up what they call family unification program or whatever, many of the Chinese came during that time, and they don't have to go to the immigration office, okay? So they really treated well, but during my family's generation, it's not. Okay, now to come back to the other thing. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act says only children and wife of American-born citizen can come to this country. So all those gold diggers, the rail workers, the people working in the Delta, and all those people, they cannot bring their children to this country because they were not born in America.
Just a word about the paper sun. In the 1906 earthquake, almost all the records in the immigration office destroyed in the fire. So they no longer have any document to show how many sons you have. So everybody can claim when I went back to visit at certain years, and same year I have a son born at that time. So, and then all the new immigrants rely on the testimony or match the information of where your home in the village with the father's confession. So this system, of course, is not perfect because also many immigrants would claim they have 3 sons altogether, and those sons can be actually a relative or someone claimed to be the son. So I have plenty of friends here. They have 2 family names, one the real father and one the paper they purchased. So the admission process, a crucial step is the interrogation, confession. And there we ask you how many steps from your house to the market and what's the color of the your temple and so forth. This become a system that is the way to beat that question is to have a cheat sheet. Remember all the questions that the officers would ask them, and to recite it and to match, and that becomes the crucial step whether you will be admitted or sent back. So the interrogation you show in one slide is exactly that very crucial step, which is partly explaining paper sun system.
Thank you very much.
Was there one more question?
Let me summarize that very quickly, if possible, for those of you who may not be familiar with the entire history. 1906, earthquake and fire in San Francisco. It burns down the Hall of Records. Hall of Records in San Francisco is very important because it contains birth records. So we can imagine the rebuilding of the city of San Francisco, city clerk standing proudly on the front steps of his building, talking to a group of San Francisco citizens, and he says, "Citizens, we need your help to recreate our records that were lost in the Great Fire in 1906. In order to do that, we have to ask you some questions." And one of the questions would have been, "Where were you born?" And some smart Chinese man stands up proudly and says, "I was born right here," even though he hardly spoke any English. "And oh, by the way, I have 5 sons in China I want to bring over here because that was allowed under the Exclusion Act. And you guys can't prove otherwise because I lost my birth certificate in the Great Fire of 1906. So this may have accelerated the start of paper families. For someone in China to become a part of a paper family and buy a birth certificate claiming to be the son or daughter of a merchant, son or daughter of an American citizen of Chinese descent, it would have cost $100 per year of age of the person buying that birth certificate. So a 15-year-old in China will cost $1,500 US to buy such a birthright. And with that would have come a coaching book filled with questions and answers about one's paper family, paper village, because the Immigration Service, they're not stupid. They quickly realized, wow, there are lots of young Chinese trying to enter the US under these exempt classes. We have to sort them out, and that's why this station opened in 1910 to sort out the Chinese young.
We have one more question.
Yes.
But just listening to what the experiences have been related to us, I'm so glad my grandmother was born in Scotland and my great-grandfather was born in Germany. But when you talk about the history of our country, how poorly we have handled immigration, and now we have another set of immigrants, I don't have much faith or hope that I can see why Congress keeps putting it off, what to do. But my question is, when some of these people were detained and then told they weren't admitted, if they spent all their money to get over here, how in the world could they pay for passage back? What were they expected to do?
That's a very good question. And after the Pacific Mail Steamship Company got started shortly after the gold rush and was the first regularly scheduled passenger line, other shipping companies followed their lead in realizing that once the immigration station opened, there well might be a Chinese immigrant being deported, being turned away from San Francisco and being sent back to China, and possibly not affording a return ticket, the price of a return ticket. So the shipping companies are in it for profit. They know exactly what to do. When a passenger boards a ship in Hong Kong, let's say, bound for San Francisco, the passenger has to buy a round-trip ticket. And when that passenger arrives on Angel Island and is successfully landed by the immigration officials into the United States, there is no refund.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Joe, so much. You've given us so much to think about. Can we please?
Please come forward and take a look at some of the reading material here, grab an Angel Island brochure, be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, that was great. Thank you. Wow. Okay, turn that off.
Oh, yeah.
And then we just have to get yours.
Very nice.
Great job, Joe.
Fantastic.
interesting. The other point of view, my mother's German. It's what you are. Got married over. Second oldest cousins from Germany back. A lot of the shit coming back. Germany invaded Poland. They were.
Had trouble getting in then?
Before the war was over, got married to German.
Oh, why?
They had a